our seas around the UK are so busy. There are so many different activities that happen on it, from fishing to offshore wind to cabling to shipping. So looking after and building space for restoration and regeneration and reseeding the sea is so important.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with a real star of the UK conservation movement, Sandy Luk. Sandy was in the private sector, in law firms and private businesses for a long time before then joining the RSPB, and then from the RSPB to Client Earth, which uses the law to win important environmental battles. And from Client Earth, Sandy then has become the executive director of the Marine Conservation Society. And I've known Sandy for a long time. I'm a huge fan. And what I really wanted to talk about with Sandy more than anything is the Marine Conservation Society's new Atlantic Coast program, because this is kind of rewilding writ large. And it's an extraordinarily romantic and ambitious vision that Sandy told me about. So I said, we've got to talk about it on this podcast. Sandy, thanks for taking the time to join me.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Sandy, why has the Marine Conservation Society chosen specifically the Atlantic coast for this big new program?
It's because the Atlantic coast is such an amazing possible cradle of life for life in the sea in the UK. It's got these incredible currents. It's nutrient rich. It's got migratory corridors, and it's got this incredible multitude of unique and diverse habitats. So it's a really, really brilliant area to start rewilding, reseeding and revitalising our seas.
And we're talking about really Cornwall up to the tip of northwest Scotland.
That's right. From Cornwall all the way to the Hebrides, really.
Which is interesting in terms of the coast. That is the habitat that was once originally temperate Atlantic rainforest, of which very little remains. I'm currently reading Guy Shrubsole's amazing book, The Lost Rainforests of Britain. And he talks about the 7 Celtic kingdoms where the rainforest was found, which is, if I remember rightly, Scotland, Isle of Man, Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, Brittany and Galicia. I think I've got that right. And these are the areas that were once blanketed with this amazing coastal rainforest. And then not so long ago, I had Angus Garbutt from the Centre of Hydrology and Ecology on the podcast to talk about salt marshes. And he gave this extraordinary description of kind of an ecosystem that is more or less gone. And that is the coastal ecosystem of Britain. And he said that you'd have had that along the west coast, you'd have had this rainforest, and that would have given on to kind of dunes and beaches, and then you'd have had these coastal salt marshes, which are periodically inundated by the sea, and then mud flats. And then beyond the mud flats, you'd have had a mosaic of seagrasses and kelp forests and oyster reefs. So this is really the nub of what you're trying to do, is to restore those kind of concentric circles of habitat along the west coast of Britain.
Yeah, and it's directly connected to those rainforests, really. And for example, in the 19th century, we had 700 million oysters in the sea around the UK. And that's what we need to get back to. You know, we've lost 92% of our seagrass. We've lost 95% of our oysters and kelp. And we need to restore all that, because those ecosystems and those, we call them the superheroes, the unlikely superheroes of the sea, really, because, you know, they're small and they're slimy and they're not that attractive. But what they do for the sea and for life in the sea, and also for us as human beings, is just amazing.
Is it fair to say that the seas around Britain are tea brown? Partly, obviously, because of agricultural runoff and the loss of our fertile topsoil down the rivers at certain times of year, but also because we've lost those filtration superheroes, the oysters in particular, but also the seagrasses play a very important role in holding the sediment down on the seafloor. Is that a fair description, that perhaps once the waters might have been a little bit more like the Bahamas?
Well, I think the sea brown is always a bit misleading as well, because, you know, there's a lot of sand and suspended sediment in the water. So that's not always bad. But it is true what you're saying about what these superhero species do. One oyster, for example, filters and cleans 200 litres of water a day. So they have these incredible functions as ecosystem engineers, all of these species, because not only do they filter and clean water, they also store and sequester carbon in the seabed. So they're really good in the fight against climate change. They're also these brilliant areas for fish and other creatures to live in as nurseries and as sources of food. And they're reef builders. So they are the basis of incredible knock-on effects in terms of biodiversity. They make such a difference to the health of the seas, and that's what we so desperately need.
So what happened to all these things? Where did the oysters go? Where did the seagrasses go? Is it all about bottom trawling? I'm sure you've seen that extraordinary, devastating scene in the most recent Attenborough film, Ocean, of the bottom trawling of the seabed and effectively the destruction of everything that grows there in order to catch a few flatfish. A bit like, I think he said in the film, chopping down a forest in order to catch a few rabbits.
Bottom trawling is definitely one of the issues, but it's not the only one. And one of the really huge issues that we have is pollution as well, and addressing pollution from runoff from agriculture, but also sewage pollution, as we've seen so much of. And for us, much more importantly, even than that, is chemical pollution, particularly from forever chemicals, PFAS they're called, because that pollution just keeps on accumulating in the sea and building up and has potentially devastating effects as well. So it's that our seas around the UK are so busy. There are so many different activities that happen on it, from fishing to offshore wind to cabling to shipping. There are so many activities. So looking after and building space for restoration and regeneration and reseeding the sea is so important.
So you've presented a vision of these ecosystems under restoration, the length and breadth of our wild Atlantic coast. That's the oysters, the seagrasses, the kelp forests, reducing pollution, setting aside no-take zones and so on. It's a seriously ambitious vision that you've got. And of course, for anyone who kind of loves nature and understands the vital importance of nature, it would seem like such an obvious thing for us to do as a country, which is to restore our inshore marine environment to vibrancy and health. What's your plan? How's the Marine Conservation Society going to do this? What's your sort of 3 or 5 year plan?
Yeah, so it's true. It is a massively ambitious vision, and it goes over decades. We're starting with the 3 to 5 year plan, but this can only happen if you really have a long-term big vision. How we're starting is small. So we're starting with pilot projects. We're starting in Scotland and then Wales with pilot projects to really look at how we can help oysters and seagrass regenerate and thrive. Because one of the issues is that there aren't enough baby oysters, oyster spat, around to even start thinking on the scale of regeneration that we need. So one of the things that's really necessary is oyster hatcheries. And you need to ensure that there's enough genetic diversity, for example, and that they're not contaminated. So it's one of those sort of knotty, complex issues that you need to deal with. And that's one of the things we're looking at. So we're looking at using a combination of restoring community ponds, which is a really old traditional way of oyster hatcheries, natural oyster hatcheries. And we're also looking, for example, at having containers that are mini oyster hatcheries that you can deploy locally. So those are the kind of things we're starting off looking at in Scotland, as well as seagrass restoration. One of the simplest things you can do to restore seagrass is to stop anchors and anchoring and moorings from destroying seagrass. And often mooring places are in areas where there naturally would be a lot of seagrass and oysters, actually. And if you stop the anchor chains from scraping along the seabed, you can make a massive difference. So there are some really, really low-tech solutions, like different types of more sustainable anchoring and mooring systems that you can use that then allow seagrass to thrive again.
So it's about delivery then. You'll be setting out to show how this is done. So you will restore on a local basis the kind of work that's already happening to some extent in a bunch of places now in Britain. Seagrasses, oyster beds, possibly kelp. There's that extraordinary kelp project that you've been involved with in Sussex as well. But you're not going to have the muscle to do the whole coast. So how do we turn that local action into something comprehensive?
Yes. So what we need to do is really demonstrate that these projects work. And then the other thing that we do is that we work with communities. And that's really, really key, because as soon as communities get engaged and behind looking after their local areas, looking after the heritage in their sea, the spatting ponds and all those kinds of things, then action happens more. And as soon as the community is involved, then we can move to the next project, because the community will look after that project that we started off. We also obviously need to work in partnership with others, and we need to look at taking a real large-scale approach to this, which will mean that in addition to our amazing funders, FatFace and FatFace Foundation, who've made this possible to start us off on this journey, we'll need to work with a lot more different partners and funders to make this possible.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed, kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. When you look at countries that have done really large-scale coastal restorations, I mean, Abu Dhabi, for example, extraordinary mangrove restoration. They've pretty much banned commercial netting of fish. You go to Abu Dhabi, you go to the coast there, and you just literally see the fish jumping out of every wave. Or you look at the massive restorations that are taking place in parts of Asia and Malaysia and so on. It often comes with real commitment by their government. The Bahamas have undertaken an enormous coral reef conservation and restoration program, working with cutting edge technology. They've done a debt for nature swap that was organized by Credit Suisse. How are we going to get our government to take coastal restoration as seriously as some other countries are?
I mean, we're working really closely with others to convince the government, for a start, that they need to take a holistic, sustainable, integrated approach to marine planning. And for that, we're working closely with the Crown Estate as well. I think the Crown Estate is absolutely key in this, because they've been mapping the seabed and they've been looking at where and how different activities might be able to be carried out sustainably. So I think that's actually going to be quite an important part of it. And, the more support and people power we have behind us to support this, the more the governments, because we're talking governments here, not just one government, will listen to us as well.
So it's quite kind of similar in a way to the Scottish Rainforest Alliance, which is about local bottom-up action. It's a very open source approach. Lots of organizations are participating in that effort in different ways, lots of landowners and communities. And there's a whole kind of proliferation of local rainforest projects with then various sources of funding. And that's what you're proposing here, is really a kind of big open tent effort to restore top to bottom the Atlantic coast and all the ecosystems that it once contained.
Yeah, that's what has to happen. Absolutely. And we need more and more and more and more communities and companies and people involved in this to make this happen. Absolutely.
So the people who are going to have a problem with this are, I guess, those that are responsible for curtailing the pollution. So we've got water companies, we've got agricultural interests with slurry runoff and agricultural, well, it's more likely to be slurry than fertilizer on the West Coast because it's livestock country. You've also got the fishing industry that's going to have concerns around areas being set off limits to their activities, areas that are being resown with oysters or with seagrasses, even though those ecosystems should deliver significant increases in the number of available fish for catching later, the kind of marshmallow test for the fishing industry. And then you've got recreational interests, I presume, who want the freedom to drop anchors and take recreational boats wherever they want along the coast, and areas would become less available to them if they're being actively restored. So how will you seek to work with all those various interests that are going to try to kibosh this effort or perhaps slow it down?
I think the most important thing is about picking your first areas and your trial areas really well. So you need to pick those where the most impact can happen, where, the best areas for oysters to flourish again and seagrass to flourish again. So we can really prove quite quickly the ecosystem benefits and the benefits for the communities. Because in the end, if communities are on board and if they see the benefits, if they benefit economically and benefit in their health and well-being, then that does make a really big difference to all other voices involved as well. And it makes a really big difference to decision makers.
What about just what your remit is the whole coast? So what are you doing elsewhere in Britain? You got this big Atlantic program, and I get why it's such a potentially wild and vibrant coast. But there's some amazing stuff down on the south coast, this Sussex kelp project that I mentioned. There's some brilliant seagrass restorations in Devon. My kids and I saw bluefin tuna for the first time in British waters off the Dorset coast this summer. And then up the east coast, you've got these amazing iconic beaches, Hokum, Brancaster, with remnants of those amazing wetlands of the fens and so on. So what does the Marine Conservation Society do elsewhere in Britain? I mean,
we have worked along the south coast, and we've worked in Norfolk, and we've worked in Sussex on projects too. And it's not that we might not do individual projects, but we just can't do everything. And also on those coasts, quite often there are some really great projects already happening. So there's some great oyster restoration work going on the Norfolk coast. So hopefully we can work with other organizations as well, but we just can't do everything.
And this Atlantic project, therefore, is going to be it's going to be your mega project, a kind of centerpiece of the Marine Conservation Society for the next few years. Tell me about the Marine Conservation Society, its history, the size of the organization. I think I've been getting the magazines now for 25 years. I'm a fan.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your support. And yes, we've been around for over 40 years. Our remit is to protect the ocean. It's as simple as that. Our name says exactly what we do. And the approach we take is that we drive cultural and political change through working with people and really based on science. We base everything we do on science. That's really important to us. And we try and unite communities, individuals, governments, businesses, decision makers to look for positive solutions, always evidence-based, for healthier, cleaner, better protected ocean.
There's a group of pretty good organisations working on marine conservation in the UK, of which Marine Conservation Society is a leader. Does that group ever have disagreements about the best approach to fixing the seas? Do you ever have two groups that have a totally different view on a particular issue? And if so, what might that be?
I think that it might not be so much fundamental disagreement, but we all use different approaches to how we want to protect the sea. And I think that's really important because one organization can't possibly do everything. So we do need people, we need organizations that maybe are really activist, and then we need organizations that work behind the scenes more, organizations that work with businesses, with governments, and engage with different parts of society as well. So I think it's not so much disagreement, it's different approaches. And I think it's absolutely crucial that it's like that. It's a really good thing.
Yeah, I agree. As a funder of environmental work, I've always found that kind of orchestra of approaches where you've got the strings and you've got the drums and you've got all the different sections kind of working in different ways to create a single piece of music. And I saw really good consensus when I was on the board of DEFRA in the run up to the passing of the Fisheries Act among the various groups working on marine issues, which I think made it much easier for ministers to take what turned out to be mostly the right decisions because the movement was united in the fundamentals about what needs doing.
Yeah, I think for the Fisheries Act, everybody worked together so closely and in such a coordinated way as well, because it was so important to get those environmental principles into the new legislation.
How good is the Fisheries Act as compared with, say, the best in class around the world? So we know that some countries, including the United States, I'm told, are pretty good when it comes to protecting and rebuilding marine wildlife, marine ecosystems. It's fair to say the environmental movement was not totally ecstatic about the Fisheries Act, but they were generally pleased that it was a move in the right direction. Can you tell me how it compares with similar legislation around the world and whether it's any good?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lawyer by background. So what I look for in legislation is mandatory provisions, duties to do things. So when legislation has principles, aims, objectives, that's all great. But if that doesn't go with a corresponding duty for the authorities, the industry, whoever to do something, then that legislation isn't really strong enough. And the Fisheries Act sets really great objectives, and it's got some really fantastic guiding principles. All the ones we needed are in there, but the duties aren't there in the way that we really need. The duties for the authorities to act and for the industry to act, they aren't strong enough. And that then makes legislation much weaker.
But does the Environment Act 2021 bolster some of those aims and goals and turn them into de facto duties? Because the Environment Act has a bunch of ratcheting targets for nature recovery, and there's an Office for Environmental Protection in place to police government on its delivery of those targets. Presumably some of those targets are marine targets. So does it provide a kind of additional impetus or some kind of backup, the Environment Act?
It should. And again, it's great that we have the targets and it should provide that impetus. But we had lots of targets in relation to the sea for a long time. So the marine strategy regulations have a whole set of criteria that there is an intention or there's a duty to meet in relation to water quality. And it covers all sorts of things like the state of the seafloor, pollution levels, biodiversity levels, lots of things. And most of those haven't been met over the last few decades. And I'm just such a lawyer in that regard. It's all about the duty to act, compliance and enforcement. And if those things, you can have great legislation with great intentions, but if those duties, the compliance systems and the enforcement systems aren't there, then it's going to be harder for those to be met.
You used to work at Client Earth, which is an amazing organization comprised of a large number of lawyers fighting on behalf of the planet and winning some pretty totemic battles around the world. With that experience, do you think, looking at the state of legislation today and those missed targets in respect of marine nature, do you think there's anything to hold on to? You know, could an organization like Client Earth or the Marine Conservation Society effectively sue government for the state of our oceans or for the slow pace of action to restore them?
I think there are still areas where that's possible. I think the habitats regulations that we have are quite strong because they have very specific and strong obligations. For example, for environmental assessments to be carried out if there's any possibility of damage happening to, for example, protected sites. I think it's becoming harder and harder, though, which is why the Marine Conservation Society, for example, is still working on policy, very much so. But we very much recognised that we need to work with businesses because a lot of business now are drivers of more sustainable and more long-term thinking, more sustainable behaviour and more long-term thinking. And we have to work with communities, because if communities are left behind, they're not going to have the health of the sea as one of their main drivers, when actually that is something that underlies coastal communities I'm talking about, but really others too. You know, it underlies a healthy economy, a healthy coastal economy and general health of people. We won't have that if we don't have a healthy ocean.
Sandy, I was always so surprised at, I guess, the power of the fishing industry in influencing government. It's not a very big industry. I think the total revenues of the UK fishing industry are smaller than the revenues of Harrods, which is a single department store in London. And so it's kind of always been astonishing to me that the fishing industry has been able to wield such influence over civil servants and politicians, and not always in a helpful way. The fishing industry has seemed to me always to have short-term interests at heart rather than the longer-term goal of rebuilding fish stocks, which would benefit everyone. Why is that? Why is the fishing industry so powerful?
I think that it's very much connected to what the UK is, an island nation, and it's part of the psyche of the UK, that the fishermen are part of the beating heart in some ways of the UK, and that's probably why they are influential. At the same time, I think if you ask the fishing industry, they'd probably disagree with you and say that they're constantly sort of sold down the river by various UK governments. I think there is an issue with short-term thinking, and maybe that's where we need to start to build the possibility of long-term thinking. Maybe that needs more support. And we need to build and work with the industry to help that transition from the damaging fishing methods to more sustainable fishing methods with lower impact.
I see that BirdLife International is organising a major conference on migratory bird flyways in Nairobi next year. I think it's in May. And ours is one of the most important. The East Atlantic Flyway is a massive migratory bird corridor, birds moving from southern Europe and Africa up to British Isles, to Iceland, and up to the Arctic and so on. And I guess the habitats that we need in order for that flyway to thrive have been substantially depleted. So are you going to use that as a major argument for restoring our own Atlantic coast, the importance of this flyway globally? That's definitely one of the things that we should be using as an argument as well. It's not the only one, it's also a migratory corridor and for marine species. So all of those, we have to use all the arguments we have for making the case for why our seas are so important. Sandy, if you had 1 minute with the Prime Minister or with the leaders of the other political parties in which to present a kind of policy manifesto for the seas, if they've got very short attention spans, politicians, what would you ask them for? I'd ask them for a holistic marine spatial planning strategy across the UK. I'd ask them for a strategy on the blue economy, and I'd ask them to ban forever chemicals. Fantastic. Well, Sandy, I'm such a fan of the Marine Conservation Society. I'm such a fan of yours. You're really doing enormously important work. And this vision you've got is exactly what we need. I think was it Lawton who said that to fix nature in this country, it needs to be bigger, better, and more joined up. Yeah. Well, Cornwall to the northwest of Scotland seems pretty joined up to me. So I'll be watching the Atlantic programme with great interest and great enthusiasm. Thank you very much for coming to talk to me about it on the podcast today. Thank you so much for inviting me, Ben. Please do keep tabs on the Marine Conservation Society's new Atlantic Coast programme. It's one of the most exciting conservation initiatives of recent times in Britain. If you enjoyed my conversation with Sandy Luk of the Marine Conservation Society, please do give us a like, share the podcast with your friends. It all makes a big difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Frank Deturi and Brett Fessel from Michigan, North America. Frank and Brett led a multi-decade, multi-agency restoration of the Great Boardman-Otway River. They're returning the river to a more natural, free-flowing state and restoring fish passage to Lake Michigan. It's one of the most ambitious and extraordinary, successful river rewilding projects in North America's history, and it's laid down a template for other river restorations that are now taking place in a number of other states. I hope you'll join me for that conversation.